The shimmering salt flats of Saltraxis 4 stretched to the horizon. An endless crystalline sea under twin orange-violet suns. Leanne Lee Grant squinted against the glare as she stepped from the transport shuttle onto the brittle crust of the Great White Basin. Salt crunched beneath her boots, releasing a puff of fine white dust that spiraled upward in the thin atmosphere. "Cadet Grant, keep up!" The commanding voice of Dr. Zarafan Kumal cut through the air. The renowned xenochemistry lecturer strode ahead, his 4 slender limbs moving with practiced efficiency across the salt plain. His violet skin tone stood in stark contrast to the whites and silvers of the landscape. The Brinehaven outpost cannot delay its orientation for Earth-native acclimatization periods. Lee quickened her pace. As the lone human student in this cohort, she'd grown accustomed to such comments. 6 weeks of field study under Dr. Kumal's guidance awaited her. 6 weeks to prove her worth at the Galactic Academy. "Yes, Professor," she replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. In the distance, the geodesic domes of Research Outpost Brinehaven gleamed like silver bubbles against the salt fields. The complex housed laboratories, living quarters, and the environmental systems necessary to sustain a dozen different species in Saltraxis Arphes' harsh conditions. This was to be Lee's home during the seasonal solar minimum, when the planet's already arid climate grew even more hostile. As they approached the main airlock, Lee caught her first glimpse of her fellow students. Velkarian Rith, a reptilian geochemist with iridescent scales and vertical pupils, was unpacking sample containers from a hovering cargo sled. Nearby, Ifori Tisha, an insectoid bioanalyst, was meticulously calibrating a handheld sensor array, her compound eyes reflecting the harsh sunlight in prismatic patterns. "Welcome to Brinehaven," said a gurgling voice. Lee turned to find Instructor Tanshu, the amphibious habitat expert responsible for the outpost's life support systems. Moisture gleamed on his blue-gray skin as he extended a webbed hand in greeting. "I trust your journey was uneventful, Dr. Kumal." "Adequately efficient," the professor replied curtly. "Though I find the Academy's insistence on including Earth-origin students in this specialized research puzzling. Salt flat extremophile study is hardly their natural domain." Lee felt her cheeks flush, but kept her expression neutral. Earth's reintegration into the galactic community was still relatively recent, only 3 generations since first contact, and such prejudices remained common. "The Earth human brings survival specialization and planetary engineering," Tanshu replied diplomatically. "Diverse perspectives enhance research outcomes." Dr. Kumal made a dismissive gesture with his upper limbs. "We shall see. Cadets, assemble in the central dome in 1 standard hour for preliminary briefing." As the professor departed, Tanshu turned to Lee with a sympathetic expression. "You are the first human to study on Saltraxis. Your planetary engineering background may offer insights our regular research teams lack." Lee nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Instructor. I'll do my best not to disappoint." Tanshu's amphibian features arranged themselves into what Lee recognized as a smile. "The living quarters are in Dome 3. You've been assigned a single occupancy chamber due to your specific atmospheric requirements." Lee thanked him and made her way across the interconnected domes. Inside, the air was cool and processed, carrying a faint metallic tang from the filtration systems. Her assigned chamber was small but functional, with a sleep platform, a work terminal, and a tiny private hygiene unit. Through a small viewport, she could see the vast expanse of salt flats gleaming in the afternoon light. After stowing her belongings, Lee checked the time and headed to the central dome for the briefing. Most of the other cadets had already arrived, their diverse physiologies requiring various seating arrangements. Velkari nodded to her as she entered, his reptilian features impassive. "Earth human," he acknowledged. "You brought thermal gear? Nights here dropped to -40 standard units." "I did," Lee replied, "though I'm more concerned about the salt corrosion on equipment." Velcari's scaled brow ridges rose slightly. You've studied salt environments? On Earth, we have places like the Bonneville Salt Flats and the Salar de Uyuni, Lee explained. Different composition, but similar challenges. Before Velcari could respond, Dr. Kumal entered the dome, his slender frame seeming to elongate as he took his position at the lectern. Cadets, he began without preamble. You have been selected for this field study to confirm what my previous research has already established: the absolute sterility of true salt flats. While my esteemed colleagues, his tone suggested they were anything but esteemed, persist in hypothesizing about extremophile microorganisms in such environments, my 30 years of xenochemical analysis has proven conclusively that no such life exists. Ifori Tisha's antennae twitched. But, Professor, the preliminary scans from orbit showed anomalous readings in the eastern sector that could indicate mineral deposits reflecting radiation patterns. Dr. Kumal interrupted sharply. Nothing more. You will learn during our time here that salt fields are fundamentally incapable of supporting life. They are, in fact, the perfect example of absolute sterility in nature. Lee frowned slightly. The professor's certainty seemed excessive, even dogmatic. On Earth, scientists had discovered microbes in almost every extreme environment, from deep-sea hydrothermal vents to the driest deserts. Tomorrow, Dr. Kumal continued, we begin with collection protocols in the Western Quadrant. Afterward, we will establish baseline measurements for the 6 primary salt composition variants found on Saltraxis 4. I expect meticulous adherence to Academy protocols. Dismissed. As the cadets filed out, Lee heard Ifori speaking quietly to another student, her mandibles clicking softly. He hasn't even considered the possibility of subsurface brine pockets. My readings suggest... Readings can be misinterpreted, interrupted Velcari, though his tone lacked conviction. The professor has studied this planet for decades. Lee said nothing, but her mind was already racing with questions. Throughout her education on Earth, and later at the Academy, she'd learned that absolute statements in science were rarely accurate. Even the most inhospitable environments often harbored life in some form. Over the next few days, Lee settled into the routine of the outpost. Mornings were spent collecting samples from designated sectors of the salt flats. Afternoons were devoted to analysis in the laboratory domes, and evenings to documentation and preparation for the following day's work. Dr. Kumal's lectures were technically brilliant, but inflexible. He systematically dismissed any evidence that might contradict his theory of salt flat sterility, often cutting off questions from students with impatient gestures. On the 5th day, during an expedition to the eastern flats, Lee noticed something peculiar: a slight discoloration in a shallow depression of the salt crust, with a faintly different crystalline structure than the surrounding area. Professor, she called, I think you should see this. Dr. Kumal approached with visible reluctance. What is it, Cadet Grant? The crystalline formation here is different, Lee explained, pointing to the discolored patch. And the refraction index isn't consistent with pure sodium chloride. Could it be evidence of microbial influence on the crystal formation? The professor's expression hardened. It is a common mineral inclusion, nothing more. Your Earth biology bias leads you to see life where none exists. He raised his voice to address the assembled students. Let me be absolutely clear once more. No life, microbial or macroscopic, survives in salt fields. They are inert wastelands. The words had barely left his mouth when the ground beneath them shuddered. A low rumble rose from deep below the salt crust, quickly intensifying to a violent tremor that sent several cadets stumbling. Brinequake! Shouted Instructor Tanshu, who had accompanied the expedition. Back to the transport, now! Lee felt the salt crack beneath her feet as the tremor intensified. In the distance, she could see the outpost's solar wing arrays shaking violently, their delicate structures swaying dangerously. The group scrambled back to the transport vehicle, its stabilizers struggling to compensate for the shifting ground. As they sped toward Brinehaven, Lee watched in horror as several of the solar arrays collapsed, their crystalline panels shattering against the salt surface. By the time they reached the outpost, the tremor had subsided, but the damage was done. Emergency lights flickered through the dome complex, casting eerie shadows on the worried faces of staff and students. "Status report," Dr. Kumal demanded as they entered the central dome. A technician looked up from a diagnostic console, their expression grim. "Primary power grid is down. Solar arrays suffered critical damage. Environmental systems are running on emergency reserves, but those won't last more than 12 standard hours." "Estimated time for repair?" asked Tenshu. The technician shook their head. "The damage is structural. We need replacement parts that aren't available on site. We've sent a distress signal to the nearest Academy outpost, but with the communication relays damaged, we can't confirm it was received." "What about life support?" Lee asked, noticing that her breath was already beginning to fog in the rapidly cooling air. "Partial functionality," the technician replied. "The desalination units were hit hard. Salt particles have infiltrated the filtration membranes. Water reclamation is at 20% and falling." Dr. Kumal's expression remained impassive, though Lee thought she detected a flicker of concern. "All non-essential systems should be shut down immediately. Conserve power and water. The Academy will send rescue within 12 hours when we miss our scheduled check-in." "And if they don't?" asked Velkari, his reptilian metabolism already responding poorly to the dropping temperature. "They will," Dr. Kumal replied firmly. "Return to your quarters and minimize energy expenditure." As the group dispersed, Lee lingered behind, watching the diagnostic displays with growing concern. The temperature was falling faster than predicted, and the power reserves were depleting at an alarming rate. Something about the pattern seemed wrong. She approached the technician. "May I see the power distribution schematic?" The technician hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Kumal's retreating form, then nodded. "Here, but there's nothing to be done without replacement parts." Lee studied the schematic carefully. The outpost's power system was elegant but fragile, designed with multiple redundancies that all ultimately depended on the solar arrays. With those gone, the reserve batteries were shouldering the entire load, and they weren't designed for that. "What about alternative power sources?" Lee asked. "Emergency generators?" "None on site," the technician replied. "This outpost was designed to be temporary, with minimal ecological impact. The solar arrays were supposed to be more than sufficient." Lee nodded slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Throughout her childhood on Earth, before joining the Academy, she had lived in a remote area where power outages were common. Her community had often relied on improvised solutions, including simple electrochemical cells made from everyday materials. A saltwater battery. The thought crystallized suddenly. They were literally surrounded by one of the key components needed. Lee returned to her quarters, her mind racing. The basic principle was simple. Two dissimilar metals in a saltwater electrolyte could generate a small electrical current. With enough cells connected in series, they might be able to power at least the critical life support systems until help arrived. But would it work with the alien metals available at the outpost? And would it generate enough power? Lee had no way to be certain, but as the temperature in her quarters continued to drop, she knew they had little choice but to try. That night, when most of the outpost had settled into an uneasy sleep, Lee slipped out of her quarters. The corridors were dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the floors. She made her way to a storage alcove she had noticed earlier, where broken components and spare parts were kept. Rummaging through the debris, she collected pieces of copper wiring from damaged control units and aluminum fragments from structural supports. These would serve as her electrodes. Next, she needed containers and, most importantly, salt and water. The salt was easy. There was an entire planet of it outside. Water was more precious. but Lee calculated that she could spare a small amount from her personal ration for the initial test. Working quietly in the alcove, she assembled 2 crude cells, using small sample containers as vessels. Into each, she placed her improvised electrodes, copper serving as the cathode, aluminum as the anode, and filled them with a carefully measured salt solution. When she connected a small sensor from her personal equipment to the completed cells, she was rewarded with a faint reading. The voltage was minimal, barely enough to power the sensor itself, but it was proof of concept. With more cells and better materials, they might have a chance. Lee disassembled her test setup and returned to her quarters, planning her next steps. She would need help and better materials. But approaching Dr. Kumal directly seemed unwise given his dismissive attitude toward her earlier suggestions. The following morning, the situation had deteriorated further. The temperature throughout the outpost had dropped to 10 degrees C, and frost was beginning to form on interior surfaces. Several of the alien students, particularly those with reptilian or insectoid physiologies, were showing signs of severe stress from the cold. In the central dome, Dr. Kumal was attempting to maintain order. "The Academy rescue will arrive within hours," he assured the assembled group, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Conserve your energy and remain in designated warming zones." Lee approached Velkari after the briefing, finding the reptilian geochemist huddled near one of the few functioning heating units. His scales dulled from the cold. "I have an idea," she said quietly, "but I need your help." Velkari's vertical pupils narrowed. "What kind of idea? Earth-human?" "A way to generate power. Not much, but maybe enough to keep basic life support running until rescue comes." "How?" "The solar arrays are destroyed, and we have no fuel for combustion generators." "We have salt," Lee replied, "and water, and metal. With those, we can make a basic battery." Velkari stared at her for a long moment. "A primitive electrochemical cell? That's ancient technology." "Sometimes, ancient technology is the most reliable," Lee countered. "I've already tested a small version. It works, but I need better materials. You have access to the metallurgical supplies, don't you?" After a moment's hesitation, Velkari nodded. "I can provide some scrap from the analysis equipment, but this goes against protocol. Dr. Kumal has ordered us to await rescue without unauthorized experimentation." "And if rescue doesn't come in time?" Lee asked softly. "Your species can't survive much longer at these temperatures. None of us can." Velkari's gaze shifted to where several other reptilian students lay in a state of near torpor. "What do you need?" "Copper, as much as you can find, and zinc if possible. Aluminum is less effective but will work if that's all we have. And containers. Anything that can hold liquid without leaking." "I'll see what I can do," Velkari promised. "Meet me in Storage Bay 3 in 2 hours." As Velkari left, Lee noticed Ifori Tasha watching them from across the dome, her compound eyes reflecting the emergency lights in faceted patterns. The insectoid bioanalyst approached cautiously. "You are planning something," Ifori stated, her mandibles clicking softly. "Something to help with the power shortage." Lee hesitated, then nodded. "I'm trying to build a saltwater battery. It's a simple technology from Earth, but it might generate enough power to keep us alive until rescue arrives." Ifori's antennae twitched with interest. "I have been studying the brine pools in the eastern sector. The salt concentration there is optimal for ionic conductivity, much better than standard saltwater." "You have samples?" Lee asked, surprised. "Several. I collected them before Dr. Kumal forbade further investigation into potential microbial habitats. They are in my personal storage unit." "That could make a significant difference," Lee said, hope rising in her chest. "Will you help us?" "Us?" Ifori's head tilted questioningly. "Velkari is gathering metal components. With your brine samples, we might be able to build something that works." Ifori considered for a moment, then gave the insectoid equivalent of a nod. I will help. Dr. Kumal's certainty about Saltfield's sterility has always seemed premature. Perhaps this crisis will open new perspectives. 2 hours later, Lee met her unlikely allies in the designated storage bay. Velkari had managed to scavenge an impressive collection of metal scraps, mostly copper and aluminum, but also some zinc strips from old instruments. Ifori brought several sealed containers of brine, each carefully labeled with concentration levels and collection locations. We need to work quickly and quietly, Lee explained. If we can prove the concept works on a larger scale, maybe we can convince Dr. Kumal to support a full implementation. They worked through the afternoon, assembling a series of cells using the scavenged materials. Lee showed them how to connect the cells in series to increase the voltage output, while Ifori experimented with different brine concentrations to maximize conductivity. By evening, they had constructed a 10-cell array that, when tested with Lee's sensor equipment, produced a modest but steady current. It's not enough to power the entire outpost, Lee admitted. But it might be enough for a small heater or a communication device. Better than freezing to death, Velkari commented, his voice carrying the rasp of cold-induced stress. The dome temperature had dropped to 5 degrees, and ice crystals had begun forming on the interior walls. Throughout the outpost, students and staff had gathered in small groups, sharing body heat and whatever functioning heating units remained. The desperation was palpable. Lee looked at their improvised battery array. We need to scale this up significantly, and we need a suitable application, something that will make an immediate difference. The primary heat coil in the central dome, suggested Ifori. It's designed to operate on lower power than the standard environmental systems. If we could power even one section, it would create a viable warming zone. That might work, Lee agreed. But we'd need at least 3 times as many cells as we have now, and we'd need to tap into the outpost's power distribution system, which would require authorization from Dr. Kumal or Instructor Tanshu, Velkari pointed out. Lee frowned. Let's build more cells first. Once we have enough power to make a difference, we'll approach Tanshu. He seems more open to unconventional solutions than the professor. Over the next few hours, they expanded their battery array, working in shifts as the cold made prolonged activity difficult. Other students began to notice their project, some offering assistance, others watching skeptically from a distance. As they worked, the temperature continued to drop. By midnight, it had reached Sudagasi, and the outpost systems were showing critical failures across multiple domains. The desalination units had stopped functioning entirely, and the last functioning heat exchanger was struggling against the encroaching cold. Lee, Ifori called urgently, her voice uncharacteristically strained. Come quickly! Lee hurried to where the insectoid was monitoring a life signs display. The readings were alarming. Several students, particularly those with cold-sensitive physiologies, were showing signs of hypothermia. 2 were already in critical condition. We can't wait any longer, Lee decided. We need to implement our solution now, with or without authorization. But Dr. Kumal, Velkari began. Dr. Kumal's certainty is killing us, Lee interrupted. Sometimes you have to challenge dogma to survive. She gathered their assembled battery array, now comprising 30 crude cells connected in series, and headed for the central dome. Velkari and Ifori followed, along with several other students who had joined their effort. In the central dome, they found Dr. Kumal conferring with Instructor Tanshu, both looking grim as they reviewed the failing systems. Professor, Lee called, approaching with determination. We have a potential solution. Dr. Kumal turned, his expression hardening as he saw the improvised device. Cadet Grant, what is the meaning of this? I explicitly prohibited unauthorized experimentation. It's a saltwater battery, Lee explained, setting the array down on a nearby console. Primitive, yes, but it generates electricity. We believe it can power the primary heat coil, at least partially. Absurd, Dr. Kumal dismissed. Such a primitive device could never generate sufficient power for our needs. It's already generating 12 volts, Lee countered. With more cells and Ephori's optimized brine solution, we could double that. The primary heat coil only requires 18 volts to function at minimum capacity. Tanshu moved closer, examining the battery array with interest. How long would it last? Several hours at least, Lee replied. Long enough to raise the temperature in this dome to survivable levels. And we can build more to extend that time. This is against all protocols, Dr. Kumal insisted. We wait for Academy rescue. That is the procedure. The rescue is late, Tanshu pointed out quietly. And we have students in critical condition. I believe we should try Cadet Grant's solution. Absolutely not. I am the senior authority here, and I will not have the reputation of this research station tarnished by panic-driven primitivism. The Academy will arrive, and we will follow established protocols until then. Dr. Kumal turned to Lee, his tone icy. Dismantle this immediately. Cadet, that's an order. Lee stood her ground. With respect, Professor, people will die if we don't act now. That's conjecture. What is certain is that interfering with outpost systems without proper authorization is grounds for immediate academic dismissal. Dr. Kumal looked around at the gathered students. Anyone participating in this unauthorized activity will face similar consequences. A tense silence fell over the group. Several students stepped back, unwilling to risk their academic futures. But Velkari and Ifori remained at Lee's side, along with a few others who had helped build the battery array. Professor, Tanshu intervened, perhaps we could test the device on a non-critical system first. If it proves effective, we could consider a limited implementation on the heat coil. Before Dr. Kumal could respond, a warning siren sounded from a nearby console. The last functioning heat exchanger had failed. The temperature would now drop even more rapidly, likely reaching lethal levels for several species within hours. We're out of time, Lee said, moving toward the primary heat coil assembly. I'm sorry, Professor, but I can't stand by and watch people die when we have a solution. Cadet Grant, stop immediately, Dr. Kumal ordered, moving to intercept her. But Lee was already connecting her battery array to the heat coil's power input. She worked quickly, bypassing the standard power supply and reconfiguring the connections to accept the lower voltage from her improvised device. This is insubordination, Dr. Kumal declared, reaching for the connections. I will have you expelled from the academy for this. Lee looked up at him, her expression resolute. Then expel me. But first, let me save lives. She made the final connection. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a diagnostic pad on the heat coil flickered to life, its display showing power input at minimum acceptable levels. The coil itself began to hum softly, and a moment later, a gentle wave of warm air emerged from the ventilation system. A murmur of astonishment and relief spread through the assembled group. Tanshu moved to a nearby sensor panel, checking the readings. Temperature rising in this section, he confirmed. Slowly, but rising. Dr. Kumal stood frozen, staring at the functioning heat coil with an expression of disbelief. This shouldn't be possible. A primitive electrochemical cell couldn't possibly. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, Lee said quietly, especially in a crisis. Over the next hour, the temperature in the central dome rose to a more comfortable 15 degrees. Students who had been on the verge of hypothermic shock began to recover, and a sense of cautious optimism replaced the earlier desperation. Under Tanshu's direction, teams were organized to construct additional battery arrays. Velkari led the effort to scavenge more metal components, while Ifori refined her brine solution to maximize power output. Other students, seeing the success of the initial implementation, eagerly joined the effort. Dr. Kumal remained largely silent, observing the activity with a complex expression that shifted between lingering skepticism and grudging acknowledgement. When Lee approached him with a report on the power generation capacity of the expanded battery network, he accepted it without comment. "We should be able to maintain minimal life support for at least 48 hours, Lee explained. "Possibly longer if we continue to optimize the cells." The professor nodded slowly. "I miscalculated," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "Not just about the viability of your solution, but about my certainty regarding salt environments." Lee recognized the significance of this concession. "Science advances through challenges to establish thinking. Professor, that's what you've always taught us." A faint smile flickered across Dr. Kumal's features. "Indeed, though I did not anticipate being the subject of such a challenge." He hesitated, then added, "Your implementation is crude but effective. With some refinements, we might extend its capacity significantly." To Lee's surprise, the professor began to offer suggestions for improving the battery design, adjusting electrode spacing, optimizing container geometry, implementing more efficient connection methods. His expertise in xenochemistry, once directed toward proving the sterility of salt environments, now proved invaluable in enhancing their improvised power source. By the following morning, they had established a stable power supply for essential systems throughout the outpost. The temperature had stabilized at a tolerable level for all species present, and the immediate crisis had passed. As Lee was adjusting one of the battery arrays in the communications bay, she noticed something unexpected. A small indicator light on the backup transmitter had begun to flicker. "The comm system is getting power," she realized, calling to the nearest technician. "Can we send a message?" The technician hurried over, examining the system with surprise. "There's barely enough power for basic functionality, but yes, we might be able to send a simple distress signal, not a full transmission, but enough to alert any rescue vessels to our position." Working together, they reconfigured the power distribution to prioritize the transmitter. After several tense minutes of adjustment, they managed to send a brief emergency pulse signal that would repeat at regular intervals. "Now we wait," the technician said, relief evident in their voice. "Any Academy vessel within range will pick up that signal." The wait proved shorter than expected. Less than 6 hours later, the outpost sensors detected an approaching ship, a Galactic Academy rescue shuttle, its solar sails gleaming as it descended toward Brinehaven. The arrival of Director Halveen, a senior Academy official responsible for Outer Rim research stations, brought formal relief operations and much-needed supplies. As teams of technicians worked to restore the outpost's standard systems, Director Halveen gathered the staff and students for a debriefing. "The Academy commends your resilience in this crisis," the director announced, "particularly the innovative solution implemented by Cadet Grant and supported by many of you. Such resourcefulness exemplifies the adaptability we seek to foster." Dr. Kumal stepped forward. "Director, I must acknowledge my role in initially opposing the implementation of Cadet Grant's solution. My certainty regarding salt-field environments, and by extension, the impossibility of deriving energy from them, was flawed." Director Halveen nodded thoughtfully. "Science advances through challenges to establish thinking. Dr. Kumal, your willingness to acknowledge this speaks well of you." Turning to address the entire group, the director continued. "In light of these events, the Academy is implementing a new saline survival clause in all extreme environment expedition protocols, encouraging the consideration of indigenous and improvised solutions alongside standard procedures." The announcement was met with approving murmurs from the assembled group. Lee felt a surge of pride, not just for her contribution, but for the collaborative effort that had emerged from the crisis. After the formal debriefing, Dr. Kumal approached Lee as she was helping to dismantle one of the battery arrays. "Cadet Grant," he began, his tone more measured than she had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology. My dismissal of your idea nearly cost lives, including my own." "You were following established protocols," Lee replied diplomatically. "I was clinging to certainty in a field where certainty is rarely warranted," the professor corrected. 30 years of research, and I never considered that salt fields, while perhaps devoid of natural life, could still hold potential energy when properly harnessed." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I am revising my thesis on salt environments. I would appreciate your input, if you're willing to provide it." Lee couldn't hide her surprise. "I'd be honored, Professor." "Good. And I believe the Academy would benefit from a formal paper on your battery implementation. With your permission, I'd like to co-author it with you." The offer, a significant academic opportunity from one of the Academy's most respected xenochemists, left Lee momentarily speechless. "Thank you, Professor. I'd like that very much." In the days that followed, as Brinehaven was restored to full functionality, Lee found herself at the center of a new research initiative. What had begun as an emergency measure had evolved into a serious academic inquiry into alternative power sources for extreme environments. Valkyrie and Ephori became key contributors to the project, their specialized knowledge of metallurgy and brine chemistry proving invaluable. Other students, initially skeptical of Lee's primitive solution, now eagerly participated in refining and expanding the technology. 1 week after the rescue, Dr. Kumal gave a field presentation at the edge of the Great White Basin. The assembled group, now expanded to include researchers from nearby outposts intrigued by reports of the improvised power source, listened attentively as the professor outlined his revised theories. "Salt fields may appear lifeless," Dr. Kumal concluded, "but in the right hands, they hold latent potential. This crisis has taught us that sterility is not synonymous with uselessness, and that even the most hostile environments can yield resources when approached with innovative thinking." As the presentation ended and the group dispersed, Lee remained at the edge of the salt flat, watching as the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon. The crystalline surface reflected the fading light like frozen stars, creating a landscape of breathtaking beauty. Director Halveen approached, standing beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. "The Academy is offering you a teaching fellowship, Cadet Grant, Xenochemistry Ecology, with a focus on bridging human adaptive techniques and alien extremophile research. It's an unusual position, created specifically in recognition of your contributions here." Lee turned in surprise. "A teaching fellowship? But I haven't even completed my final year." Exceptional circumstances warrant exceptional measures," the director replied with a smile. "Your actions here demonstrated not just technical knowledge, but the kind of innovative thinking the Academy seeks to cultivate. Dr. Kumal himself recommended you for the position, quite emphatically, I might add." Lee looked back at the salt flats, considering the offer. Just weeks ago, she had been the outsider, the Earth human trying to prove her worth in an alien academic environment. Now, she was being offered a position that would allow her to formalize the bridge between human ingenuity and galactic science. "I'd be honored to accept," she said finally. Director Halveen nodded approvingly. "Excellent. You'll begin next term, after completing an abbreviated version of your remaining coursework." As the director departed, Lee remained at the edge of the Great White Basin, watching as the last rays of sunlight transformed the salt crystals into a sea of multicolored fire. What had once seemed a barren wasteland now represented possibility and potential. In the distance, she could see Dr. Kumal leading a group of students across the flats, collecting samples with renewed purpose. Valkyrie and Ephori were among them, their earlier skepticism replaced by enthusiastic inquiry. The salt fields of Saltraxis IV would never be seen the same way again. Not by the Academy, not by Dr. Kumal, and certainly not by Lee. What had been declared sterile and lifeless had, in crisis, revealed its hidden potential. And in that revelation lay the true spirit of scientific discovery, the willingness to challenge established beliefs, to see possibility where others saw only emptiness. As Lee turned to rejoin the research group, she smiled to herself. Sometimes the most profound discoveries came not from sophisticated technology or elaborate theories, but from the simple determination to find a solution when all seemed lost. That was a lesson worth teaching, and one she would carry forward into her new role at the academy. The wind picked up, sending spirals of salt dust dancing across the flats like tiny whirlwinds. In their movement, Lee saw not the sterility that Dr. Q. Mal had once proclaimed, but the dynamic potential of a world still revealing its secrets. And in that potential, she saw her future.